So if you've just joined, we're just waiting a couple of seconds for participants to enter because this webinar just went live. Okay, so I will go ahead and start. So welcome everybody to this Q&A session on the innovative use of social media for remote sensing and SDG monitoring. These are unusual times, and to quote somebody on Twitter, I hope you're all staying positive and testing negative or whatever is the appropriate saying these days. I'm Ingmar Weber from the Qatar Computing Research Institute, and it's my great pleasure to host this event together with Kieran Garimella from MIT and Emilio Zacchini from the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. We're also thankful for the support from the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. This live session is closely tied to the corresponding pre-recorded session at the UN World Data Forum. We hope that you've already had a chance to watch the recording, but if not, the issues we discuss should also make sense on their own. On the Attendify page, you will also find key references and slides used by our presenters during their in-depth presentation. So please have a look at that material at your convenience. The topic of this session on how to use social media for remote sensing and SDG monitoring is particularly timely given the current pandemic. Due to COVID-19, many traditional server-based data collections have been put on hold. However, our idea for the session predates COVID-19 and arose from a number of discussions that Kieran, Emilio, and I have had on the use of social media data for monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, when talking to external stakeholders in the UN system, there sometimes was the impression that social media monitoring can only be used for sentiment analysis, and that due to selection bias, no meaningful insights could be derived. Having worked in this area for many years, we felt that such opinions were overly simplistic and deserve to be updated. To hopefully create a more nuanced view of how social media can and cannot be used for humanitarian and global development issues, we decided to invite a panel of experts to share their experience. Before introducing these experts who've kindly agreed to join this call, I'd like to explain the structure of this session. First, we will start with a set of very short opening statements from each panelist. If you would like to have a more in-depth presentation about their work, then we refer you to the pre-recorded session on Attendify. After the round of opening statements, I will ask a number of questions to the group of panelists. These questions are partly based on questions that we received from some of you during your registration. Thanks again for those who submitted questions. After this, I will open the floor to questions from the audience. For this, please use the appropriate feature in Zoom. There's a Q&A feature that you should see. Kieran, Emilio, and myself will be drawing from this pool of questions. We might also unmute you so that you can ask the question in person. As this is a session about social media, we strongly encourage you to share your thoughts and remarks on social media, preferably on Twitter. For this, we suggest to use the following hashtags and handles. I'll also try to copy and paste this myself to the, or maybe Emilio or Kieran, if one of you could also paste this to the chat so that others can copy from there. With these matters out of the way, it's my great pleasure to introduce the panelists. I will very briefly introduce each of them at the beginning before asking them to give their brief opening statements. In the interest of time, I'd like to ask you to refer to the online webpage for more detailed biographies. First, and I'll just move some things out of the way here, I can really see better. So first, we'll have an opening statement from Stefano Cresci. Stefano is a researcher at the Institute of Informatics and Telematics at the National Research Council in Pisa. Stefano gave an interesting presentation on timely and targeted information acquisition from witnesses via hybrid crowd sensings. In a nutshell, they use Twitter and mention users explicitly to sort of get input from them during in particular disasters. Then we had another excellent presentation from Catherine Hoffman-Pham, who's a PhD candidate in information systems at the at the NYU Stern School of Business and a research associate with UN Global Pulse. She presented some work on her experience using Facebook advertising to administer targeted surveys in the Global South. Next, we had Ritti Kashyap, who's an associate professor of social demography at the University of Oxford and a professorial, sorry, apologies for this, maybe this automatic slide transition is set up, and a professorial fellow of Nuffield College. She presented on using social media advertising data to measure the global digital gender divide. Also very innovative work using advertising data from Facebook and other online advertising platforms. Then we had a presentation from Sitya Pramana, who's an associate professor at Polytechnic Statistica STIS, and also a head of the subdirectorate for the statistical model development and leading the big data team of BPS Statistics Indonesia. His talk was entitled Innovative Use of Social Media for Remote Sensing and SDGs Monitoring in Indonesia, and in particular included work on using geotag tweets to derive statistics on commuting behavior. Last but not least, we had a presentation from Lisa Singh, who's a professor in the Department of Computer Science and a research professor in the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown University. She presented work on how to combine Twitter data with other types of data to predict forced migration in the context of Iraq. With this out of the way, I suggest that we go in this order. So Stefano, feel free to share short opening remarks of up to 2 minutes with the audience.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me well. I want to thank Ingmar for the nice introduction and also Emilio and Kiran for organizing this very interesting session, for which I am very thankful and honored to be able to contribute, also considering the renown of the panelists here. So thank you for this. As Ingmar introduced, I'm a computer engineer here at IIT CNR in Italy. So my background and my contribution to this panel are, I think, will be mostly focused on system and computer engineering side of the problem, which I hope will be orthogonal to some of the expertise of the other panelists here. If you did not see my presentation for this panel, the work that I presented here was related to a system for combining opportunistic and participatory sensing from social media. So the possibility to actually combine data collection from spontaneous user messages to data instead targeted questions to the users for collecting additional data in a participatory sensing approach. So this, of course, can be used to complement traditional strategies like those based on surveys, web or paper surveys. And is, again, also orthogonal for using advertisements for collecting demographics data. So that is my background and my contribution. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Stefano. Catherine?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Catherine Hoffman-Pham. I'm a PhD student in information systems at NYU. And on this paper, I was working with collaborators in political science and demography. And one thing that we noticed is that in both of those fields, people are starting to use Facebook advertising as a way of recruiting survey respondents. And they found that, for example, in developed countries such as the US, you're able to sort of reconstruct nationally representative opinion surveys using a Facebook sampling. And one question we had was whether this would work as well if you move to countries that have lower Facebook penetration or lower internet access. And so for our project, we focused on 2 pilot countries, Kenya and Mexico. And essentially we placed targeted ads targeting people by gender, age, education level, and location, and then compared the results that we got with nationally representative surveys. So both the census and then the Afro and Latino barometer opinion surveys. And I guess sort of in broad strokes, the conclusions are that we found that the people that we could recruit on Facebook were biased both with respect to these nationally representative samples, as well as with respect to the population of Facebook users as a whole. So for example, Facebook users tend to be more educated on average, but then if you're not accounting for education in your stratification, the sample that you get for your surveys is even more educated than the average person on Facebook. Similarly, another sort of surprising finding was that while Facebook is sort of very cheap as a method of recruiting respondents, which is why a lot of researchers are using it, we found that costs can actually grow quite high when you're trying to recruit people in areas that have low Facebook penetration or low numbers of users. And so we've tried to document some of these practical considerations for survey methods so that researchers, when planning their studies, can sort of decide if this is an appropriate tool for them. And to understand some of the limitations. And the hope is, again, that now that we're in this world where we're trying to do everything remote and that we can actually pose risk to ourselves or to our enumerators by going out in the field, that having a good understanding of these platforms and how they can be used to recruit survey respondents will be useful for many different members of the UN system and the audience listening more generally. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Ricky?
Thanks, Ingmar, and hi, everyone. Thanks also to the other two organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm excited to be here. I'm a demographer, and I'm interested in how we can use digital data sources for population generalizable measurement. And I'm also interested in my work in understanding the impact of digital technologies on the Sustainable Development Goals linked to gender equality and population health and well-being. As an example of my work in these topics in my presentation for this panel, which was in the pre-recorded video, I talked about the work that I've been doing with colleagues on using data from social media marketing or advertising platforms to track global digital gender divides. So we know that SDG 5 calls for using technology to empower women, but gender gaps in internet access and mobile phones exist, but are sometimes hard to monitor due to data gaps in existing surveys or other infrastructures that could be used to monitor them. So we've been looking at how gender gaps computed on large online platforms such as Facebook or Google's advertising platform. So essentially ratios computed, gender gaps computed as ratios, female to male ratios on the number of users of these platforms can potentially help fill some of these data gaps linked to internet access gender inequalities and mobile access gender inequalities by comparing gender gaps on these platforms by gender gaps in internet and mobile access computed using surveys. And we find generally that Facebook and Google gender gaps are reasonably good proxies. They're good signals of women lacking internet access and mobile connectivity, especially in areas where there are significant gender inequalities, such as in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So that's what we've been working on, and I'm excited to talk more about these issues in the panel Q&A. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sitya.
Hello, everyone. Good morning over there, maybe good evening here in Jakarta, Indonesia. So first of all, thank you for the organizer for inviting and also for having us here, for Kiran, Ingmar, and Emilio, and also all the panelists, extraordinary panelists. So I'm Setya, as mentioned by Ingmar, that I'm Associate Professor at the Polytechnic of Statistics in Jakarta. And currently, been 1 year, I'm appointed as the head of Subdirectorate of Statistical Model Development, which is now this division is responsible for developing big data in BPS, Statistics Indonesia. So the pre-recorded presentation I have mentioned before that I discussed several approach of using social media in our case. Of course, in Indonesia or in BPS, we do several big data cases, not only social media, but for today, we focus on social media. So first cases is using commuting statistic, using social media for using the location from mobile device. So that is using the geotag of the Twitter to see the mobility tracking between people, between areas of the people in Greater Jakarta, which is now the epicenter of COVID in Indonesia. And then the second project that I discussed in the presentation is how we can use the, not from Twitter, but from Instagram, also geospatial from Instagram to see the pattern of mobility of tourism in Indonesia. And the third approach is how to use the online and social media to see the impact of tourism promotion in Indonesia. And then lastly, the fourth project that I mentioned or I presented in the pre-recorded presentation is how we use social media to infer subjective happiness index. So the results showing that we can use the social media, different platform. It could be Twitter, it could be Facebook, it could be Instagram, other platforms, to infer or to have a proxy for different type of SDGs indicators. I think that's all from me, Ingmar.
Great, thanks, Lisa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this session. I'm super excited. My name is Lisa Singh, and I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Science and a research professor at, in the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown. And I'm a computer scientist, which means that I really care about the how of social media and how we can use this in responsible ways. But I look at different ways to use or blend organic data with more traditional data sources to tackle societal scale types of issues. I have three particular areas of interest. One is forced migration, one is gun ownership and gun violence, and one is the impact of online movements on policy changes with regard to things like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. So at a high level, the question that I'm interested in looking at is how we can use social media data and newspaper and other forms of organic data with traditional administrative and survey data to improve early warning of forced migration. We found, in my presentation shows that blending different forms of data within a hierarchical Bayesian model did help us to predict movement patterns in Iraq. And what we're interested now in thinking about is how we can take these findings from Iraq and generalize them to other regions of the world. We used both a theoretical model and a data-driven model and blended them together in order to do it in Iraq. And we think that type of blending might work in other regions of the world. And we're currently focusing on Venezuela to see whether or not this will be a viable option for other regions. We're hopeful that everything we construct that we'll make available to the community so that others can use social media in models that they've already developed and not have to construct all the variables themselves. Ultimately, the goal is to develop meaningful and timely models that can serve as the basis for early warning tools to provide evidence for policymakers. I'm fortunate to work with an amazing team that was co-founded by Susan Martin, Jeff Coleman and I, and now is co-led by Catherine Donato. And finally, I kind of just want to mention that we're all here and we're all grappling with different issues related to social media data and other forms of organic data. And while we know, all of us know this isn't a panacea, I think we can see from this panel and from the presentations that it's a time to not ignore these data too. When you begin to look at problems at a global nature, you very quickly see that different places have different types of available data at different temporal and spatial scales, at different levels of quality. Therefore, we have to think about ways to build robust methodologies that allow us to use these different available sources of data and find ways to compensate for the noise, bias, and non-representativeness in order to actually tackle some of these large societal scale problems we have. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Yeah, maybe I'll start with a question following up on the issue of bias that you also mentioned, Lisa, and some others of you sort of so often. Also, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that's often mentioned as, okay, well, you can't use social media because obviously not everybody is on it, but then also due to the risk of leaving people behind, right? So for example, if you derive, let's say, commuting patterns only from Twitter users, what about the people that are not on Twitter, right? Like would their, I don't know, their roads not be improved or sort of so because you don't, you don't know they commute, right? Or maybe if you, or maybe in Stefano's case, right, what about, those who are not on Twitter with their experience during a disaster not matter. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do you, think about these issues? Can they be addressed, right? Is it a matter of, somehow adjusting your model or or is it like a fundamental flaw? How do you think about this? I mean, maybe we can go in the same order because I assume all of you have some thoughts on the topic. So maybe, yeah, I don't know, Stefano, feel free to share your thoughts on the issue of bias and how to potentially address it.
Yeah, sure. So, well, first of all, I would say that we should follow the standard pipeline regarding bias. So awareness, measurement, and adjustments. And I think those should come in succession. So we should first be very well aware of the sorts of biases that we can encounter. And we know that social media data is actually affected by quite many of those biases. So starting from the population that is available on different social media platforms, then the data collection strategies, which is a point that is very related to both my work in general and also my contribution toward this panel and this initiative. And then also we should be able to measure these different forms of biases. And why is it important to measure them? Because in the last step, we would want to be able to adjust for those biases. So before spending a few words on data collection biases and how we kind of tackle this issue, I see that there are a few works that actually tackle that kind of prediction task, let's say, or a nowcasting task, where social media data is used to kind of estimate a different variable, let's say. We know that we can reweight different features that we extract from social media to account for the biases. And that has been used as a profitable strategy to, let's say, if not eliminate, to reduce the effects of biases on our estimations. And it provided useful benefits in, for example, health-related models. So that's something that we can do. But taking a step back, so in the data collection step, we can also do something about this. So for example, we are aware that there are different strategies for collecting data from social platforms, like different APIs that provide access to different kinds of data. We know that there are rate limits to the amount of data that we can obtain from the platforms. How can we circumvent these limits? Well, there are different strategies. So one, for example, that we adopted is to try and split our queries. So for example, the keywords or other query parameters with which we ask the social media platforms to collect the data, we can split them across different crawlers in order to be able to have different crawlers, each one getting up to the maximum amount allowed per crawler. And in this way, we can generally collect more data than we would with only one single access to the social media platform. So that is one way to kind of circumvent rate limits and be able to collect more data, which is thus, let's say, a more representative sample of the, let's say, all the users on the platforms that are discussing a given topic, for instance. So that is something that we've done also in the system that I presented in the pre-recorded sessions. It's a strategy that we use. So multiplying the number of crawlers to get a better coverage.
Catherine, your thoughts on bias?
Thanks. I'm lucky to go after Stefano because he makes a lot of the best points for me and more eloquently than I could. But yeah, I sort of agree. I think the first step is really trying first to recognize that all data sources have some sort of bias. So you think maybe the census is the gold standard, but if you're using census that's 10 years out of date, that will be biased with respect to the current population. But I think the most important thing, as Stefano said, is to try to understand the bias and really be aware of it. And in particular, from our work, we suggest trying to find other data sources that you can use to calibrate or at least try to understand where those biases might be strongest. So offline surveys, for example, might be a nice way to supplement online surveys. Next is to try to address it. So as mentioned, there are technical approaches like propensity weights or even Bayesian methods for combining data sets. You can also use study design approaches with how you collect your data. So in our case, we use targeted ads and targeted data collection so that, in areas of the country where we knew that there may not be a lot of users, we had to specifically target ads just to those areas to try to recruit people. The other thing I think you can do is sort of frame a question that won't necessarily be shaped by this bias. So, one trick is to use, for example, longitudinal samples. So you sample the same person over time and you look at changes within that person. So you can understand how individuals are changing rather than necessarily using that individual as a proxy for the whole population. And then the other is that I think sometimes it is just necessary to do some supplementary offline data collection. So some populations won't have a mobile phone or won't have access to the internet, and you may need to go on the ground and try to find those people and understand their opinions. And then the last thing I would say that's most important is also just to really be transparent about those biases. So I think often when we're writing up papers, we're excited to share our results. but really making sure that we include a section saying what the limitations are, who we're representing when we have those results and who we're missing out, so that future researchers can also dig more into those omitted populations.
Thanks, yeah, Ritti?
I think at this point, I'm just adding really to what has already been covered really exhaustively by both the first two speakers. I think in our case, the work linked to understanding gender gaps is very much, I see it motivated as trying to sort of understand and examine sort of gender bias on these platforms, and also just in the world that is in the online world. So I think, you know, a lot of the work I see also presented in this panel is very much motivated by getting a better understanding and awareness of it, and then either by comparing against some kind of ground truth or some other methods trying to account for it. I think the question of bias is really, or when bias is a real encumbrance, is also fundamentally linked to what you're trying to do. So of course, if your goal is like population generalizable measurement, then bias is very problematic. But if your goal is, for example, to understand sort of, you know, changes to something in response to some event, bias isn't necessarily problematic. There might be other issues that one might have to take into account. For example, you know, does the system generating the measurement, is it the same across those two time points? But at the same time, you know, in a different kind of study design where the question is, for example, linked to understanding changes, you know, bias might not be the issue at stake. There might be other issues at stake. So questions linked to, you know, what is your analysis about? What are you trying to do? What are the hypotheses that you want to bring to bear on the data are really relevant when thinking about what is bias really an issue here or not.
Thanks, Sitya.
Yes, I think it's already been discussed really good from the previous speakers, but bias indeed is one of the main concerns in using social media, especially in Indonesia, where we have a quite big digital gap between provinces in Indonesia, in the western part and the eastern part. And for social media, the one who use social media mostly are in the main island, Java, and also mostly in the city. So that's also kind of thing that we need to discuss, or we need to take into account when we do analyze the data. As mentioned by Stefano and also Catherine, we do use weight, as mentioned before, based on, okay, like see the number of Twitter user per regions, or the number of population, and also the number of you know, specific age for using Twitter, because for us it's only between 15 to maximum is 45 years old who use Twitter, or 30 years old. So we focus, and also we do use the weight based on that information. But the one that the study that we use for mobility of using the Twitter, that is in collaboration with the Global Pulse, we do have overall, I mean, the whole data of Twitter at that time, because we get the information of the data directly from Twitter through Global Pulse. But for other project, we do, as Stefano mentioned, that we do several scroller. You know, you have to take from to get more information by splitting the work into several machines, so we can get the data as mentioned before. And also when we report the result, especially the data, when you get information only part of the samples of the data, we put information that the information of the number of tweets that we obtain, so that to make it transparent that this only the numbers that we get from the tweets. Not only, we cannot use that as generalization of Indonesian population, which is quite big, but at least we can use that as the proxy of informations. So again, we usually highlight the information that we can only, the result can be used only for representing this subpopulation and sub-regions. I think that's all from me.
Thanks, Lisa. I know a lot has been said already, but please feel free to add your thoughts. Sorry.
So maybe, yeah, I think a lot has been said, but let me say one thing. You know, it is a good way to sometimes look at indirect measures and proxies, as was just said. So while it may not always be the best representativeness of a population within a country or the full population set, it can be useful to understand some type of an indirect indicator. So for example, if I care about movement, I'm trying to measure indirect indicators related to health security or violence. And I can look at the changing dynamics of posts that are related to people talking about violence that's occurring. So it's not, if it doesn't matter to me if one person is talking about it or 50 people are talking about it. What matters to me is that more or less people are talking about it over time. It's that change. And so for certain types of questions, it can be very valuable to use as a way to see the changing dynamics as opposed to trying to just measure a population.
Yeah, great, thanks. Apart from bias, like another concern that I often hear raised, which is a valid concern, of course, relates to privacy or more broadly, risks of abuse of using social media, sort of. So, on the privacy side, of course, some people say, also in the research domain, well, if it's open, right, like it's fair game, you can just, collect it and do whatever, sort of. So others would sort of object that people might still not expect that their data is, algorithmically collected or analyzed. And even though, probably many people have legally consented to it being collected and, being processed, they might still not be actually aware, right? So they're certainly not necessarily sort of informed consent. So that's on the privacy side. We'd love to hear your thoughts, but also apart from privacy, do you think privacy is really the biggest risk, or there are other risks? So for example, like maybe even if you don't identify individuals, you maybe identify certain groups of people or sort of, so that might be vulnerable or sort of, so, right? And maybe, some of those methods could also be, abused or misused in another context. So I know this is a very broad sort of question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, if crisp as possible, on in particular on the topic of privacy, but also on maybe other risks that are being overlooked. And but maybe let's go once in reverse order, sort of. So I know, Lisa, you've also thought a lot about this issue, so I'd love to hear your thought on privacy and related topics.
Yeah. So I think very deeply about the ethics of using social media data, and have confined myself to date to social media platforms that I believe people believe that their data are being broadcast to the world. And I do think it's a question that we need to think through, that ethical side of it. But getting to the privacy side of it, and to the exposure side of it, we're in a situation where it is super easy to infer things from just a very limited amount of information that's publicly available. That just is true. That's a fact. And as researchers, I think we really need to think through when it makes sense for societal scale types of issues to use these data sources, and when it makes sense to actually try to get consent to use some of these types of data sources. So if we're in a disaster management type of situation, I think that there are times where, using those signals is imperative for the health and well-being of the individuals there. But I really struggle a lot with this question, because it is the case that algorithms have gotten so good that with very limited data, we can do very well on inferring lots of demographics that people may not want us to infer about them. So inferring things that we feel comfortable that people would be okay with for us to tackle these societal scale issues is important. And setting guidelines and standards that are universal really needs to, I think, happen at some point. And the final point I want to make is there's a lot of bots and misinformation out there that is also infiltrating the data. And as we are trying to use these types of sources on these really challenging problems, we have to compensate and account for those so that we can understand their influence, because they change. The way that they work changes through time. And if we are not capturing that change, we might believe a phenomena is happening that's not really happening.
Great, thanks. Siti, I'd also love to hear your thoughts in particular, because I mean, you're also, I mean, you know, affiliated with the government in some sense. So maybe, you know, the concerns related to privacy or how your work is being perceived might be different from, you know, just a researcher, you know, in a purely academic setting. So love to hear, you know, how
Yes.
you approach these things.
Okay, yes, thank you. So when we do research, actually, that's in academic situation, that's okay, right? When we use that in the government, that's quite different, because you have to really make sure that all the privacy and all the legal aspects are met, right? So sometimes a few weeks ago, we discussed with our legal bureau that whether we can, all the analysis is actually based on our regulation is okay or not. So actually they said that because there are some regulation that we can have an access to different data set, so that will be okay. But the main problem actually is not only privacy, because as mentioned before, that the data is actually publicly available data, and people already have a consent that the data can be accessed publicly. But in our case, is the main things is actually as mentioned by Lisa, is the misinformations, because there are a lot of fake accounts and bots in our case, especially usually if you discuss about using social media for politics, right? So there's a lot of let's say people or bots that actually trying to give propaganda to depict to deceive, try to make like different opinions based on their background. So this is actually our the main risk of using social media in our case. So what we have done is we do really let's say hard work on cleaning these fake accounts and bots, and also try to make whether it is actually true people who are tweeting, for example, or doing the social media, or is actually a robot. And also there are several studies to see how these bots and also fake accounts can be taken on from the analysis. So that's actually the biggest actually risk for in our case for using social media. Igmar.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ricky. If again, you don't feel obliged, but if there's something to add,
yeah. I just want to sort of reflect on some of the issue of sort of how linked to the fact that a lot of the data streams that we're sort of using, or at least that I've been using in our work, is to some extent we're using sort of aggregate data on numbers of users broken down by demographic characteristics available from the advertising platforms. But in a sense, the data stream is somewhat unpredictable, and they have also an obscure data generating process. So we don't always know, for example, what it is that we're really measuring. We get a certain number of monthly active users that meet certain kinds of characteristics, but we're not sure always if that's stable over time, or if you were to query it again, or if it changes. So I think the fact that these data streams are unpredictable and they have this kind of obscure data generating process has implications both from the perspective of research, but also it doesn't allow for the creation of sort of transparent models of data sharing for research that might be relevant and important in some context. So I think, coming back to a point that I think Lisa made, we need to think about, this is not a sort of a case-specific issue that is handled in an ad hoc way, but working towards general principles that allow these data to be leveraged in a way that is ethical, systematic, but also transparent from a research and policy insight generation perspective. That's all.
Thanks. Catherine?
Yeah, so I'll just make maybe two quick points that I've just seen through our own work. One is that, we know that there are like malicious actors that take advantage of privacy gaps, but I think on the other hand, one thing that surprised me was that respondents are very willing to furnish information, often not in careful ways. So posting their phone number to public chats or things like that. And, as researchers, we did an institutional review board process to sort of do an ethical review, but that was our choice, right? Like we didn't have to, we could be anyone, collecting this data. So I think there are real risks with the lack of monitoring, sort of how the data is being used. The other thing is that, the platforms obviously infer a lot of characteristics for their own purposes, but what surprised me is how readily you can gain access to that as an external researcher. So, for example, Facebook guesses whether or not I'm a commuter, and researchers can estimate the number of commuters that live in my zip code. And I may not even be aware that that data has been calculated about me or is being shared. And then in terms of the other risks, I just wanted to echo sort of Lisa's point about misinformation. So I think we talk a lot about bots and a lot about sort of, state government actors trying to manipulate the conversation. But I think also a growing risk that I see, at least in COVID, is that a lot of misinformation is being transmitted between friends and family. So sources that you trust in sort of informal channels in ways that's very hard for an external person to identify and monitor. So I think that's going to be a big area of research going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefano.
Yeah, some of the things I wanted to talk about have already, of course, been touched by the other panelists, which is good. So one thing I would like to reason on is the awareness of privacy risks. Again, in my work, I experimented with two different approaches to data collection. One is an opportunistic approach where spontaneous user posts, for example, are collected and analyzed by a system. The other one is a participatory approach where users are aware that they are sending data to a system. So this difference between data spontaneously shared that is transparently collected by a system and data targeted to a system, I think this is a crucial difference, because we are contributing to put data on the web, to put data online publicly in many cases, and we have no idea of how many systems, how many applications are actually collecting our data and building their services out of our data. We don't know it because we don't get notified by this, okay? Or it happens only in a limited number of cases. So this is a problem of awareness to me, which I think maybe it should also receive a kind of a bigger attention also from us probably. So that's something that we could go towards. Another point that is relevant to me is the trade-off between privacy and let's say features and services offered to us. We should all be aware, I mean, not only us, but all the users, for example, of social media, that many services are built out of our own data. This is still related to my previous point. So if we want to have a higher privacy, are we okay to kind of leave back some of the features that we are having? So for example, recommendation systems, they are based on our previous interests, on our perceived interests, that kind of stuff. So if we don't want systems to profile us, if we don't want those systems to feed on our own data, can we live without recommendations? Maybe we can, maybe not, but that's something that we should all reflect upon, I think. And then one final point that I noted, I was happy to see that Setya actually accounted for bots and for possible manipulation in his work. I know many others are doing, which is actually very good. But I'm a little bit worried. I've been a little bit worried in all these years because I'm maybe in a peculiar position. I studied social bots and misinformation for quite a few years. At the same time, I studied the use of social media for emergency management. And I noticed that there are many works, also scientific works, that use social media data, but they do not take into account at all possible interference by automated accounts or all that kind of stuff that might, again, bias the data collected by the system. And since these issues are quite widespread as of today, I think all works based on social media data should at least perform some very simple, like sanity checks on the data before jumping to conclusions. And yeah, that's something that we maybe should pay a little bit more attention on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good comment. So now I'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience. So there's one question posted by Raymond Sirato. Raymond, I will allow you to talk, so maybe you can ask the question in person. Hopefully this works. So let me see. Allowed to talk.
Hi.
You should be able to unmute yourself now, Raymond. Hello.
Yeah, I had a question which is also about privacy, and I was wondering how investigators who work in commissions of inquiry in the UN or fact-finding missions should think about privacy and informed consent, because it seems that informed consent could, in some cases, maybe tip off individuals or groups that are under investigation and might lead them to remove information from their accounts that was previously available publicly. I just wondered kind of how investigators should think about that problem.
To the broader panel, or anyone in particular?
Just the broader panel. Sorry.
No problem. No problem. Anybody from the panel who would like to answer this? Is there like a risk in asking, like, what do we lose if we ask? So, give our way that we are collecting data, do we, change behavior? Do we lose information, crucial information potentially that was previously publicly available?
So
jump in.
I can say a few things about this. So I think one of the things that's interesting for us to just philosophically debate, perhaps, but for the UN to think about at a deeper level, is who owns the data, right? So the data is owned by the user, and it's shared then to the platform. And does the platform actually own the data now, or does the user still own it? And do we have a right to look at the data because it's publicly and organically there? And if it's public, then one would argue that you don't need consent. A lot of the data that we used in our studies are all public, and these are things that people have decided to share and make open. So perhaps consent is not as necessary. However, if it is private, then it might be the case that there needs to be certain contact with the platforms themselves in order to access those data sets, because it's important to have procedures that actually make sense. So in case it's not someone like the UN who's trying to access these data, right? So I do think that this is a really tricky question, because it matters as to the platform you're using, how public the data was originally, and whether or not you believe the data is owned by the user or the platform or a hybrid. And I mean, these are a lot of different ethical stages, but I think as the UN starts to think about these things, they need to look at those types of issues.
Anybody else would like to add to this?
Yeah, I had a couple just high level comments. So I mean, I think, when you think about privacy violations, I guess there are sort of like institutional review boards have sort of pioneered how to think about these types of problems and the level of risk. So when you're doing a study, are there any harms or benefits that an individual could accrue from that study? So that's one way that we decide whether they need to be informed and involved. Another would be, are you collecting personal information or aggregated information? So maybe you're collecting their location, but you're only aggregating locations that, 5 square miles or 10 square miles. And so then it's okay, that not every individual is at risk from collecting data at that level of aggregation. I would say in terms of informed consent specifically, one sort of trick that not a trick, but a strategy that many people allow is that if the study would really be jeopardized by doing the informed consent in advance, sometimes you can get permission to do the informed consent after. So after someone's completed a survey, then you say, well, actually this was part of an experiment and your data was used in this way. And if you have any concerns, you can contact this person, so that you don't, bias people in their answers, but you can still inform them that they were part of a research exercise. And then the last thing I would say is that for UN actors or anyone, but UN specifically may be useful, is that UN Global Pulse has a risk assessment tool that you can use to evaluate your own studies and sort of identify where there might be potential harms or concerns. So I put that in the chat box, but that may be helpful for some specific projects. Great,
thanks. For the other people in the audience, again, feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A feature. In the meantime, I have another question myself about this, what you see as the unique strengths of social media. So for example, what do I mean by this? So when it comes to, let's say, studying commuting behavior, I mean, others have used mobile phone data and sort of CDR data, right? Sort of so that might be like maybe even a more natural a data source to study, right? Or maybe when it comes to forced migration, social media is one of many data sources, and you could add satellite imagery or sort of other big data sources or sort of so. So I'd love to hear your thoughts if you think there's something like unique about it, or if it's mostly is it just convenience, or it's easy to collect, or is there like a unique strength in terms of what you can measure with social media that you cannot measure through other types of, let's say, even other big data sources like mobile phone data, financial transactions, satellite imagery or something? Is there anything that's unique to social media in your work? Anybody, whoever feels free to, I mean, yeah.
So for me, there is an aspect that's very unique. So with mobile data, we would be able to get actually people moving, right, or satellite data. But the thing that social media data gives us is that there are two things. One is their perception. So it's very hard to know how people are thinking about the situation around them and what their perception is of the economy, of their health, of different insecurities. And social media is a very good way to get very timely perception type of information, as well as beliefs and behavior. Like, what are people thinking they're about to do? This is an area where we can see that with social media. And if you didn't have those posts or those, you know, whether they're Instagram versus Twitter or Facebook, you would know where people were, and you might know their political affiliation or certain things like that that you are used to inferring from different means. But you wouldn't know what they're thinking at that moment, or wouldn't be able to try to capture some sense of that in the context of movement.
Other thoughts? Maybe Setia, yeah, please.
Yeah. So, okay. As you mentioned, the strength of social media, I think Lisa mentioned that we can have it faster and also easier. Sometimes it's free if you take like some API that connected. That if you want to have the full set, usually you have to collaborate with different institutions. But the strength of that is, again, we can get the perception and also the information more, the mood of the people directly and timely. And then, but for a geolocation, for example, actually, the strength is that we can get it for almost not that, we don't need to pay like that, right? It's free, right? But if you want to do more for mobile processing data, for example, we have to give an access, right? And also the data, it's quite also a lot to get that information. In Indonesia, in BPS, Indonesia, and also, we combine several. Actually, we combine several data for having the mobility between several regions. So, for example, we use the data of mobile positioning data and also the data from travel diary apps, which we developed together with KTH Stockholm, to see the mobility and also to see the robustness of using mobile phone data. Because sometimes the mobile phone data is only one particular network operator, right? We cannot get from different operators. So this also kind of only part of the people. So we combine that with the travel diary and also the social media to see more, to see in more holistic view of the mobility and also how they mobile and how the perception on the mobility. And actually, the strength for us is because it's cheaper. So we don't need to do more on accessing the data and also to develop an application. That's all.
Thanks. Anybody else feel free to add, but you know, yeah.
Yeah.
Stefano. Or Ritti, sorry, Ritti, please go ahead, Ritti, sorry.
Thanks, Ingmar. I just wanted to say that sometimes, I mean, just studying behaviors or studying just who participates on social media is also interesting and meaningful. Social media is in many contexts a place for a vehicle for civic participation, for participation in wider sort of social discussions around different kinds of topics and issues. And it's also a way of accessing information and social networks and in being embedded in different kinds of communities. So there's a reason to think that it would be useful to even study who's participating in social media as some kind of a indicator of online participation or social engagement. So, there's a case to be made for why we should be studying social media as well in of itself, not just because it's a proxy for something else, but also for a thing in of itself as being an object of inquiry.
Stefano, sorry, I cut you.
Yeah, I just wanted to summarize maybe some of the things that have been said. And one unique key features, I think, of social media data, I think it is multimodality, because we talked about and we studied text, but we also have images, photos, videos, emojis, geolocations, social relationships. Some of these have been said. So all of these combined together in a single platform, I think this gives a lot of potential. And also the possibility to have longitudinal data as well as snapshots of data related to a given point in time. Yeah, and of course, timestamps. I didn't mention timestamps before, but that's another kind of thing. So all of this combined, I think it could be, yeah, pretty unique, also considering it is cheap and the big data that we have access to. So that's interesting, I think.
Okay, Catherine, yeah. Yes. I cannot hear you. You're not shown as mute, but for some reason I'm
mute on my own computer, sorry.
Okay.
Just 2 points that I think are worth adding. So one is that you can actually also access what people say in their own words, and you have the chance to ask them directly what they think, which is very different than a lot of the remote sensing data. The second advantage for researchers really, I think, is the measurement of the social network structure, which is really hard to capture in an offline environment. So particularly when you think about spreading of information, about influence, a lot of these questions we just couldn't answer at scale until we had access to social media data sets.
Thanks. I want to have probably the last round question is related to something that Vinicius asked online. There's a question that also comes up again and again, and that relates to data access. Now, the question related access has different aspects. So one is just like if you have all the technical knowledge, how do you access this? Do you access this through APIs? Do you access it through partnerships? Do you purchase the data? But there are also other aspects, right? Like like how much technical knowledge is required, like are there specific tools you use to access the data? Those could be other questions. And then one aspect that is also mentioned in the question online is the questions related to to gatekeepers, right? Like who could control this access, who could shut it down, and how would this play out, in the future? So maybe it's a broad question of access, both technically, politically, and also if you have any particular tools that you would recommend, whichever way you want to take it. So whoever, feel free to jump in, whoever would like to share their thoughts on data access. Okay, I'll pick on somebody. Richie, please. I'm sure you must have some thoughts.
I'm happy to start. I think so. In our case, the data that we have been using in the work that I presented for this panel is from social media marketing APIs, and Facebook has a marketing API, and it's so there is and it can be queried using programmatically using languages such as Python or R. So of course, there's some degree of computer programming know-how that's needed to access these data, and then also to clean them and make them usable, and then of course analyze them. And the data are free so launching an ad, and of course, as Catherine was saying, to and that can become expensive quickly, especially if you're targeting very specific groups of people. But if you're before launching an ad, the information about the potential audience of that ad, that information is provided free. So I guess, but that being said, even though from an access perspective, these are aggregate anonymous data that are provided from the advertising platforms, there is an issue of data ownership and limitations here. So we can't, for example, access historic estimates. We don't know how many people were Facebook users in the past. We can do it prospectively moving forward, which we've tried to do in our work. Then there's also the issue of, as I was also referring to earlier, if something changes about a particular behavior or a feature, for our query, we say we want to know how many are mobile users that use iOS or have an iPhone 8 and who are female of a certain age group. Sometimes we can get very different estimates across days, and it's not clear why that is. Sometimes it's a data quality issue, but it could be how that behavior is defined. Either it could become outdated or it's been changed. So some of these features change and we don't know how or why they do. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So there are issues linked to quality and continuity, as well as what and how much you can do with it. That's really, in some sense out of our control. And these are important issues to bear in mind. Part of this is also because these are data that are owned by private companies. So, and again, as I said, one of the big, I think, issues that needs to be resolved is transparent modes of data access. Some companies are doing this better than others, where researchers are given access to these data sources. But this is an area where there's a lot of room for, I think, development.
Anybody else would like to say, share comments on data access?
So, for me, Ingmar. So for us, as I mentioned before, the Twitter for that particular study, we collaborate the UN. So usually for a large data that we don't need to use the API, we get the data from directly from the UN Global Plus, which actually they have access to that directly. But for others, we usually do some web scraping or crawling using, as mentioned by Ridi, Python or R. It can be another other platform or Kappa, for example, we do have that. But for others sources, usually we do some, we have some MOU with different, like let's say mobile network operators, with some companies which actually have the data. So because now I'm leading a team for big data, which actually the source is not only social media, but also satellite images and mobile phone data, so web scraping and other. Usually I make kind of a group that related to data engineering. So we do have like around 15 data engineers that actually get the data, that acquisition, and make sure the data are actually streamed online, so they are continually. And then after that, we have the data analyst team that actually analyze the data, and the analysis all depends on the type of the data. It could be satellite image, it could be different group, social media in a different groups, and also for phone data will be in different groups. And for and also we do have a group that are related to meteorological parts, which actually to make sure that all the quality, and also as mentioned before, to see whether we have some cleaning of the boats or other let's say outliers or noise from the data. And also we do have development parts actually based on from the academia. They help us to develop a system, and also for system of getting the data and analyzing the data, then we can directly implement it in the government. And also all those teams actually around 20, let's say 30 people that actually now working on big data of different aspect on different sources. And actually I learned a lot from all of the participants, that what I have to do next for our projects. I think that's all, Ingmar, from me.
Great, thanks. Any last, I know we're already 2 minutes over, so any last quick comments on the topic of access? Great.
Can I add additional one? I forgot to say that also we do collaborate with different ministries. For example, for remote sensing, we collaborate with Agency of Assessment Application Technology, and so Geospatial Information Agency. But the challenge actually to make this collaboration instead of the technical aspect, right? To make the collaboration between this organization, that's also part of the challenge to get an access to data. That's, I think, from me, Ingmar. And also
Great.
others. Thanks.
Yeah, so we're already slightly over time. So I'd like to again thank all the panelists for participating. Thanks also to the people, of course, in the audience for attending. There is much more if you're interested in this topic on the Attendify page for this event. So please have a look at the full pre-recorded session and also at the material that the panelists have shared. So in particular, papers and slides, and feel free to reach out either to the panelists or the organizers, so Kieran, Emilio, or myself for additional questions. So, and again, thanks to IUSSP for hosting this webinar. So yeah, with that, so at my end, it's good evening, but whatever that is at your end. So thanks again, and hope to see you again in another session in the future. So yeah, stay safe.
And thank
you very much. Thank you, thank you, Stefan. Bye, Catherine.
Bye.
Bye, Lisa.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice meeting everyone.
Thank you, Ivan. Bye, Lisa. Yeah. Thank you, Ingmar. Bye-bye. Emilio.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.